everybody to this third PESP pop-up event. My name's Hayley Fitzgerald, and I'm just going to briefly do an introduction and then pass over to Colum and James. I'm delighted that they're presenting today. They're both from Liverpool John Moores University. What some people will be aware of is actually the PESP Invisible College for BERA was meant to take place on your IM Marsh campus in 2020, but because of COVID, both BERA and the Invisible College was cancelled, which was really unfortunate because I think a lot of people were looking forward to coming over to Liverpool and being on what is a very historic campus. And according to Colum, as well I understand, it was going to be the best ever PESP Invisible College event. But of course, we'll never know now, will we? However, I think because you're both here today, what's great is we may get a glimpse of what we missed in 2020. So I'm really delighted about that. No pressure on James or Colum, though, of course. Now, for me, this presentation speaks, I think, to wider debates really about the synergies or differences between physical education and sports coaching. I think it's important, really important, that we have these collective conversations, and I think this session very much reflects the spirit of trying to have some open dialogue, really. If anyone is listening and wants to post questions in the chat, please feel free to do so. And I know Colum and James will take those questions towards the end of the presentation as well. So without further ado, I'm delighted that Colum and James have both volunteered to talk to us today.
Yes, thank you. And yeah, it's great to be here. I think I know a lot of people on the call, so for anybody who doesn't, I'm Colum Cronin, joined by James Rudd. My background is predominantly in coaching research, predominantly a qualitative researcher, looking at coaches' lives, coaches' experiences, coaches' education. Theoretically, my research is rooted in phenomenology as a philosophy and as a method. And at John Moores, I lead the master's degree in sports coaching, and on that I work with James. James, not everybody might know you on the call. Will you introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So as Colum said, my name's James Rudd. I work with Colum. I work predominantly on a physical education degree. I have probably a bit of a different background to a lot of physical education, so I did work in schools for about a 7-year period, both here in the UK and Australia. I then went into motor learning and motor development research, and very much down a quantitative research path, which was, yeah, it's been very interesting. But I bring that forward. I now teach on the physical education degree and on the sports coaching masters around pedagogy and motor learning, and blending that space with movement development, as we'll discuss in this presentation. So yeah, great to work alongside some wonderful minds such as Colum. We have many rich conversations, which has led to this presentation we'll be discussing today.
So it's a bit of an unusual session because we're very much mindful that we're doing the session in a pandemic, as we've just been speaking. You know, the last year has been very different. It's been tragic for many people, and that tragedy is not always behind us. You know, for some people it's alongside us still. When I look back at the last year, myself and James, we've been thinking about this last year almost as a liminal experience. So for anybody who's not aware, liminality is a term kind of advanced by the sociologist Victor Turner, and it really is a concept used to kind of describe a passage, a journey between two places, so neither here nor there, a process of moving from one place to another place, maybe a more comfortable place to an uncomfortable place. And that is basically a way of how we've been seeing this last year. We've been neither pre-COVID nor post-COVID. We're in this liminal space in between. For anybody out there trying to make sense of that concept, you know, higher education is often referred to as a liminal space in people's careers. You know, they move from childhood to adulthood via a 2 or 3 year space at university, or for PhD students, and I see some of them are on the call, you know, the period between submitting your thesis and doing your viva can be a bit of a liminal space. You're neither in the past doing your thesis nor got that PhD yet, you're somewhere in between. And we've kind of felt this last year has been a bit of a liminal space. We've neither been one thing nor the other. And what that does is it's prompted us to maybe think about learning. And I think it's prompted probably these PESP webinars as well, to be honest. It's given us space and time to think of where we are around certain topics. And for that last year, we've been kind of thinking, well, how is learning being conceived? And how would we want it to be conceived as we come out of this liminal space? For James and myself, that liminal space is probably more personal because as we were talking earlier, we're leaving the historic IM Marsh campus and we're moving to a new city centre facility in Liverpool. Again, we've been at Marsh for this last year really, apart from a handful of days, nor are we at the new building yet, even though it's up and ready. We're at home, we're in between, so we're in this liminal space. And as we're in that liminal space, we've kind of been thinking, as I said, how would we want learning to be in that new building? Now, for anybody who doesn't know, leaving the IM Marsh campus is a big deal for us because the IM Marsh campus is historic. Irene Mabel Marsh founded the campus in 1900 as Liverpool Physical Training College. In 1920, it moved to the new site. So for over 100 years, people have been doing physical education, coaching, dance, outdoor ed at this campus. And it's left a big legacy. It was one of the first PE training colleges for women in the country. It's got a legacy of La Bande dance, of, you know, movement and gymnastics. One of the first gymnastics curriculum was developed in the sports hall there. So it's got this long legacy and we're about to leave that and move somewhere else. And again, that's prompting us to think and reflect at the current time. So what have we been reflecting on then? Really those questions, and the questions that will guide this presentation is, how has learning been conceived in PE, coaching and movement over that period of time? And how might learning be conceived as we move forward? And what are the consequences and implications of those conceptions of learning? So that's what we've been thinking about for the past year. We've decided to share our thoughts. They're a work in progress. They're not finished. They've been influenced by some of the PhD students and some of the people on this call. So we don't take all the credit, but we'll happily take any of the blame if we misrepresent anybody's work. But as I say, they're a work in progress, and you know, over the next year when we do come out, maybe we'll arrive at something more finished. But we think it's still worth showing or working out and what we're thinking. So to that end, let's progress. We haven't just been looking at our PhD students' work. We've actually gone back to look at how learning was conceived at Marsh. And here we have a picture, rhythmic dance from 1923 and 24. You know, it's for me, this is really exciting to look at these archives and to see what was physical education, physical activity 100 years ago. Here I'm seeing a lived outdoor experience. I'm also imagining dialogue. I'm imagining the dialogue about the excitement about, you know, what are we going to do in our dance? I'm imagining dialogue after between learners and educators. How did that go? What did that work? I'm imagining dialogue between educators talking about that. Maybe even a little bit of a performance, because you can see here there's a bit of a raised platform on the right-hand side. And that's giving you an opportunity to put on a bit of a performance. And I'm looking at that and thinking, you know, when they come down, are they going to discuss what they've learned, how they performed, how they moved, how they worked together? So I'm looking at dialogue and I'm looking at experience and I'm looking at outdoor lived experience when I see pictures like that. When I see this picture, I see the value of that raised platform, you know, being an environment which allows a performance. Because I see here in 1924, those same dancers putting on a performance for the community. So the community were invited into IM Marsh. The community were asked to come along. It was done to raise money. The students performed for the community, raised money for the Union of Girls Clubs, you know, which was kind of a social justice, trying to empower and emancipate women in Liverpool in 1920 and provide youth clubs. And this reminds me almost of a Deweyne type approach to education, where education is not locked into a school, but is situated in a community and beyond the confines of a school or a university, embedded in everyday experience. And again, I'm thinking of the dialogue. Could you imagine the dialogue post the performance, the community mingling with students, students talking about how they performed, were they nervous, did somebody make a mistake, did they perform as well as they had done in practice, educators getting a rich experience to help educate from. So this is what I see when I see these pictures. Not just Stansted, IM Marsh. Here we see 1924, the building of the pool. There's actually pictures in the archive of people digging it out. But I like the one on the right here. You can almost see the anticipation, the excitement, you know, of what will happen when that pool is full. And I think on the next picture, you'll see it took them, you know, within the year 1924, the pool was completed. And you can see the opportunities that that afforded. So we've got archives here of students completing life-saving awards, gaining skills, skills again relevant to the wider community, you know, water safety, you know, PE teachers coming out in 1924 qualified as lifeguards and life-saving. And that opportunity being afforded by the building of that environment over the past year. So again, I see lessons there for us as educators to think about in the environment and think about reaching beyond schools. Wasn't just pool, water safety was also done in field trips. You know, we see some examples here of people swimming in a lake in Wales, but there's also other examples of people canoeing and rowing on the River Dee in Wales. And again, I'm thinking of education being outdoor, being experiential, being an opportunity for dialogue and for communication and for connecting with people. And that really seems powerful to me because educators, learners having a shared outdoor ed experience prompts dialogue, prompts listening to each other and provides an opportunity to learn. More formal experiences include tennis, 1924 here. You know, tennis on the front lawn at IM Marsh. And we might try to get a game in before we move, James, you know, before the end of the year. I might turn up with a bat and ball and we'll see what security have to say to us. We'll show them the pictures and I'm sure they'll allow us. But what I see here is, again, is I see small groups bonding over an experience, talking. You know, there's a lack of social distancing, but we'll forgive them. You know, there's bonding taking place. There is also a gender element that I think we need to acknowledge here. You know, tennis was an activity that would have been accessible for women at this time, and not every activity was. There's also a class element and inclusion elements that we need to think about here. Who's represented in these pictures? Was the college accessible to every woman from every class? I'm not sure it was at this time. Unfortunately, we've moved on, although we've got ways to go as well. As I think we've heard in some of the previous PESP seminars, actually, that we do need to work on making that inclusive. So I think that's something here to bear in mind. Less formal, the sports day in 1924, and I smile when I see these pictures, particularly the wheelbarrow race, which I remember doing myself. It just goes to show that the pedagogy that I experienced and that people on this call might have experienced, actually it probably wasn't new in 1985. It's actually got rooted in a history of over 100 years. You know, what has come before us has influenced the pedagogy that we experienced and that we might deliver. I think that's fascinating for us to start thinking about lines and change and how quickly that change comes and what traces from the past are alongside us as we go out and educate in schools. So that's what I'm learning here from this one. That's what kind of my perceptions of these early photographs. A pedagogy which is experiential, which is community, which is based beyond the school, which remains to some extent with us, which was influenced by wider notions of gender, inclusion, wasn't divorced or neutral or isolated from them. And this is what I'm reading into these pictures. But James, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on this. And I know you've got some ideas, so I'll hand over to you.
Sure, thanks, Colum. I guess when I looked at this and you asked me to kind of reflect on these photos, the thing which really, well, struck me is to take a step back and have not look at the direct experiences as such, but more what through that education program, what are they developing, what are they learning? And so to answer that question first, I really have got to highlight my position or where I'm coming from. And very
so
much
before we do that, James, I'm just going to press record so that everybody gets that.
Oh, okay.
Or Hayley, have you recorded? Is it possible to record?
I think it's recording, is it not, Colin?
Yeah, it's the record button has been pressed right at the beginning.
Yeah, brilliant. Sorry, thank you. I was worried about that. Go on.
Jump forward a slide. There we go. Yeah, so, okay, yeah, so we're recording, that's great. I guess my position, first of all, I'm movement learning, motor development with a keen interest in physical education, very much, as I'll speak about later on, exploring this for a moment from an ecological space. And so that kind of gives me a world view of this. And when I was reflecting on these photos, I see education is kind of its etymological roots of exucere, to lead out into the world. And it made me reflect on, when I'm looking at this education program at Marsh, we're seeing individuals who are directly experiencing things for themselves, meaning knowledge is not entirely to be something that's transmitted into a receptible mind as such of an individual, but is grown through actively finding their own way through various important physical activity landscapes, be that swimming in the pool or out down in North Wales. And I think so, it's embedded in the culture and it's embedded in the nature. And I think that's wonderful. I really pull that out, and I have a lot of, really enjoyed exploring those archives with you, Colum. And I can imagine a program then, and the educators who come out the other end, shall we say, of this journey at IM Marsh are ones who then really appreciate and respect the importance of that, of attending to things rather than acquiring knowledge and understanding of things, which maybe you don't actually need to experience them. So I think, and for us as a subject which is very much focused on the importance of learning through movement, I think that was a really rich lesson. And it was a program of exposure, not one of immunization, I guess, is it just things I was reflecting. And it kind of, the importance of the environment and the outdoorsness of it really kind of led me down this route I've been exploring around inskillment. So the idea where we develop a deep understanding or a knowledge through dwelling and exposure of these environments. I think that's really important, and it shifts us towards these softer pedagogies, which I speak about in this paper, and me and Colin will talk about a little later. But it's not one, well, I see here anyway, Colin, of enculturation, of learning specific rules, or specific tasks, or specific ways of doing or instructing. So that's certain things I'm seeing from these photos as a start.
So thanks, James. I mean, we got this idea of exploring, being connecting to the environment, tuning to the world out there. It's important to say we do have some archives that not all of the pedagogy was like that. This is the infamous military drill style of physical education, physical activity. Probably a remnant of the 1902 model course. I'm not sure many people on the call will remember that. But the 1902 model course was an early form of a PE curriculum, which had a significant military influence. The rationale behind it was really around developing discipline, around developing fitness to prepare people for a life of war to come, particularly the lower class. And so we see some of this still happening 20 years beyond the model course at Marsh. So 1923 military style drill. And for me, that's, you know, it's associated with regimentation, it's associated with rules. It's associated with monologue, where there's an instructor at the front giving instructions, not much dialogue going back or between the participants. And that military influence happened at Marsh, but it wasn't just Marsh. You know, my background's in coaching, and the military influence in coaching is also present. So, We've got a great PhD student, Rhys Chapman's done a paper on the history of coaching. And, one of the things to realize is that the first England football manager was Wing Commander Walter Winterbottom, who had served in the RAF. Come from a military background, had experience as personal training, went on to become the General Secretary for the Council of Physical Recreation, so a big influence on physical education, not just coaching, and in turn went on and became the first chair of the Sports Council. So some 50 years later, we still have that military influence. And even today, in a coaching lexicon, we talk about coaches using drills, training athletes. We talk formations every Monday night on Sky Sports. And formations, these are terms left over from a military legacy. And I think this is something that's helped me to realize here, is that our pedagogy that we've inherited is not immune from these wider influences. As I said, lots of rules, lots of regimentation, and a lot less dialogue in this. But we also saw some of the more progressive methods and situated pedagogy earlier. So moving on from here, we're going to kind of jump up into the 1950s, really, and start moving up towards that. And James, I'm wondering if you can maybe talk us through how over time this military drill was phased out, and maybe particular emphasis on primary school, kind of what was replaced in terms of pedagogy and PE, and what lessons we might learn from the 1950s and just before.
Yeah, sure. I'm no PE historian, but I have taken a keen interest in exploring, especially around the primary education, what some of the curriculums were of the past. And as you said, Colum, actually those drills you would sit, shut up that last photo, was commonplace up to around the 1950s in primary schools across the country. Those curriculums were very much, our objectives were politically motivated in many ways around physical fitness, development of good physique, good posture, compliant students. But they were progressive at the same time. Those another 1933 curriculum, that very much had a broader, it included games, it included athletics and gymnastics, it had opportunities for children to work in small groups, etc. So there was changing of the times, but sure. But I guess my interest in movement development, motor learning, the curriculum which really caught my eye, and I want to spend a little bit of time discussing, was the moving and growing curriculum of 1952. So, and I have this slightly romantic idea of those educators who had come through maybe these very experiential curriculums saw a different vision for physical education, and they started to maybe explore that in this curriculum. And a moving growing curriculum, it came into play in 1952, and it was one small book which was very much a case study or a small example of how children learn through development or through growing, and the changes we see and the things we may want to attend. And it was designed for teachers and parents. Alongside this book was a planning your PE program, so how you go about putting this into practice. And it's a book I've been quite using in my own research over the last 5 years or so. So if we pop on to the next slide here, Colum, so we move into really exploring what we first of all in this planning of a program is the objectives of the curriculum were what we would want to see really in any primary school today. In many ways, it's about educating the whole child, experiential experience, a variety of experiences from gymnastics, creative dance, ball games, ball skills, very much focused on enjoyment, achievement for all, inclusion, and so forth. And a methodology had I guess this was probably another really big shift, is actually how the pedagogy or the teaching and learning practices which were employed to support this behavior, support children in this. It moved from a direct teacher perspective, teacher at the front of the class in this kind of exercise sort of HIT session of some sort, to more of a child center. The teacher was guiding rather than directing, problem solving and being creative within the moving was encouraged. And something again which tweaked my eye when reading and I'll come back to later, is that apparatus was out at the start and tended to be out for the whole lessons, but it was very rich with different environments, with lots of things for children to interact with. Okay, so you very much were almost like a learning designer within aspects of this curriculum. But the other thing which I kind of put on these slides, Colum, is this idea at the heart of this 1950s curriculum, when you're reading through it, is they have two real key principles. This idea of exploration and repetition, which kind of lie at the heart of it. I sent this to you a little bit in advance. Did you have a chance to have a quick read or a look at it? And did anything jump out for you when you were reading through? You're on mute, Colum.
Yeah. So I'm fascinated by this, and I loved reading this because I love this exploration. And in particular, what I really like is, okay, we've got this idea of, okay, creating a rich environment full of equipment, allowing people to go and explore. But what I really like about this is this last sentence here. This does not mean that children should be left to flounder helplessly, but that they should have time for necessary exploration and discovery. And I really love that last sentence because I'm seeing a lot of polarized discourse in education, which says we either tell children what to do or we allow them to explore. Yet in 1952, we knew it wasn't just one or the other. It wasn't as simple as that. Allowing people to explore wasn't just put out equipment and then go home, you know, there is more. And I also see nuance, and maybe a nuance that we've lost in our wider educational discourse. You know, I also see nuance in the repetition, because again, modern day discussion of repetition is almost rote learning. It's almost repetition, rote learning, the same thing over again, didactic, controlled, you must sit down and you repeat this. Yet this idea of repetition for me is much more, there's almost something existential about it for me. When I look at this idea of repetition and this example here, it's the idea of rereading a new book. Well, when you reread a book, when you're not the same person you were when you read it the first time. You've learned, you have ideas, you've developed, and the book is seen differently. The environment is experienced differently. So repetition doesn't necessarily mean rote. We can have variability between repetitions. We can have repetition without having repetition almost, if that makes sense, because we have changed as an individual. And I look at this and I see those nuance and those concepts. For me, this repetition is more of a deep dive. It's revisiting, recontemplating, redeveloping, immersing ourselves in revisiting environments to see what we can see differently this time. And I look at these two nuanced descriptions of exploration and repetition, and I think maybe some of our modern PE discourse or our modern education discourse could benefit from some of this nuance. That's what I'm thinking, James. I don't know if any of that makes sense to you.
No, it does. And it's the same things in which, as we'll come to, when I start to explore ecological spaces and the papers I write about now, it very much has these kind of central ideas to them as well, and how we understand these ideas of exploration and ideas around repetition.
And I think why I came to that is because we've seen something similar in coaching research. So I mentioned, you know, we've got Reese who've done a study. In fact, I'll let you continue first. It's the next slide after you. So I'll come back to Reese's study in a second, because I'm seeing the same coaching where exploration and repetition were maybe valued around this time. I'll let you go first though.
Cheers, Colin. So yeah, look, it's, I guess again, when I was exploring this, things start to, when you're reading these pages and you're coming from an ecological position, you start to see similarities and it really does resonate. So for instance here, I'll let you all read that quote on the left, but the importance of kind of the interaction and that exploration leading to new understanding within an environment. But then some insights as well, which I commonly write around is here, which was said back in 1952, it's misleading to separate individuals and environment, because in practice their interplay is so complex, it's difficult to entangle, difficult to entangle or disentangle the genetic and social factors from there. So they're appreciating this complexity in the interaction and the symmetry between an individual and an environment within their movement. And the challenge is then potentially of us trying to deconstruct this, or through our pedagogical practice, trying to break these things apart to then build them back together. Because as you see from that bottom quote, movement we know is more than a sum of isolated movements, or it changes from one position to another. Its overall characteristics may be described as a term of rhythm or flow. So these ideas had very ecological. Did you pull anything from this column, this slide?
Yeah, so I mean, again, I like this example on the left in the green box. I'll read it out. Maybe some people are on audio, so for benefit, talks about a child climbing a tree, talks about, you know, finding his way up. So maybe again, we have that gendered notion of what is a learner there that we might want to learn a lesson from and become more inclusive. But beyond that, it talks about the awkward angle, the long stretch of climbing the tree, wriggling full length, and through that process, beginning to learn more about trees, but also more about himself. New realizations of height, width, depth, weight, and resilience. And why I like that is because the second time you climb the tree, you're more knowledgeable. You are different than what you were before. And you might find a new path based on that knowledge. So again, I look at the picture and we see three people climbing the tree in different ways, finding their path. And it takes me away from this, there is one way to move, or there's one way to exist in an environment, because they're showing us there are three ways, at least at this time, but the next time they climb the tree, they are different. So they might find new ways, and that takes us to that deep dive. I see it in the right-hand corner picture as well. We've got two children climbing the bars, but they're finding their own way. They're doing this in different ways. And we haven't prescribed the model. We haven't imposed the model. We've allowed, in this case, in 1950s, exploration to do that, to find their route. So I am seeing lessons on this, and I'm thinking about my own pedagogy, and I'm thinking about, do I enable that exploration and that creativity? And I do think I'll bring up the coaching example now, James, if we can. Because in the 1960s, we saw coaching texts with some similarities to that moving and growing curriculum, which encouraged exploration. This is based on Reese's work. Reese has been part funded by the FA, and John Moores looked at coach education over 50 years. You know, he's worked with Ed, who's on the call, and Noel, who's on the call, so credit to them as well for this work. And what he found was, back in the 1960s, there was an FA guide to training developed by Alan Wade, and it's full of games. And when we interviewed people who were involved in the game at that time in coach education in the FA and outside of the FA, you know, they talked about really a text and an emphasis on provoking thought, inquiry, opening minds to new ways that the game could be played, opening minds to new ways to solve problems and new skills, you know, putting people in environments 2v2, 3v2, 3v3 that might be somewhat, or to greater and lesser extents, representative of the larger environment that they're preparing them for, and then allowing them to explore. Now, it wasn't just a complete free-for-all. If you look at that text, again, there's that gendered view. The text refers to the footballer as he throughout, and the coach as he throughout, you know, and there's still powerful tutors, maybe reflecting some of that military emphasis still in place here of high standards of dress, behavior, attendance. That's still emphasized in there as well. But there is this emphasis on pedagogy, and there is this emphasis on exploration in games that represent the wider game, trying to make sense and finding new ways. And this is a powerful text that was pretty influential. You know, an example of how this text influenced PE, not coaching, is actually some 20 years later. So this is from Thorpe and Bunker, page 4 of their 1986 text. Pretty powerful, pretty influential text. And in it, they cite Alan Wade. Alan Wade, who was in 1960s advocating games, opening minds in the FA, advocating education. We got to give Loughborough some credit here, okay, because a lot of that was done at Loughborough, where Alan Wade was helping them. But again, citing that text, which is reminiscent of the moving and growing curriculum has a big influence on the games-based curriculum and has a big influence on PE through teaching games and for understanding. So again, another reminder, this pedagogy, it's not behind us, it's with us today, and we should maybe learn from it and go back to it and look at it. I want to show some examples. I hope people will indulge me of what this 1950s curriculum might look like. I won't show the whole video because I'm conscious of time. I'm also not 100% sure this will play if we've not enabled videos. So we might not be able to see this. I probably should have done that beforehand. Haley, we might need your help to do that under a setting.
Oops, I think that's Sarah's department. She's Director of Technology.
Sarah,
if I press anything, I'll cut everyone off.
I don't know if Sarah can. Oh,
yeah.
This looks promising. Okay, and I'm going to skip ahead various points here now, but just to prove this is not fake, we'll let it play, hopefully. No, it's not playing particularly well. We'll try again. I think we might be bested by the technology in this case. So I'll briefly describe what you would have seen, and it might catch up, we never know. But what you would see is you see a gymnastics hall and you see lots of equipment out, but also lots of people doing different things. And I really am gutted that we can't show you that, because it is the old gymnastics hall with the climbing frame pulled out with the ropes down, and they're actually being used. So for many of us, here we go, we can see people moving in different ways. Not one approach throughout, and they're spreading out. I'll give it another second or two. What I will do is I'll jump up here to possibly the more interesting aspect around 8 minutes, and it might catch us up. But we see people using the climbing ropes, we see people using the frames, we see people vaulting, we see people working in pairs, people exploring different ways to vault, different ways to move. It's a bit of a shame we can't show it. We'll move on, but I do want you to trust me that we have this 1950s footage, okay, of people going through and moving in different and creative ways. Putting routines together that they designed. Working in pairs. So we'll move on, but hopefully you've seen enough of slow buffered footage to get the idea that there's lots of people experimenting, being creative, moving in different ways, having the freedom, not a regimented lesson. And as I said, we'll move on, because actually I think pedagogy did move away from that. Okay, it moved away from Alan Wade's text of small games, open minds, explorations, creativity, to greater and lesser extents. We need to be careful not to generalize. Okay, and James, maybe you might want to talk us through why we moved away from that a little bit. Why did that 1950s exploration?
I'm still exploring this.
Out of it.
Sure, I'm still exploring this at the moment, really. But a few things struck me, just which really resonate with my own experiential experience of trying to deliver this curriculum in many ways. One is it states in the curriculum some really important points, which I just want to highlight to people. It moved away from the training syllabuses of here's your lesson plan or your 7-week scheme of work to follow. So you had a scheme of work and there were 7 lessons in the old, up to the 1933 training syllabus, etc. What it was replaced with was, well, actually, the teacher needs to be able to furnish and develop their own lesson content. So the autonomy had high level of autonomy. They wanted the teacher to teach the children which are in front of them, to look at them, explore, and then design, become designers of that lesson, but also of that curriculum itself. It was, I reckon, maybe slightly naively, based on the ideas that teachers will want and have capacity and the time to do this. So, but not the want, I think the want is there, but the time, amongst other things, to be able to do this. But what I think was, there were two, what I think, daggers maybe in there, of why this maybe didn't be picked up as much. One is where they rightly acknowledge at the time, or they highlight at the time, that there's no single framework or kind of theories which can support this learning and development process. It's important that the teacher explores a range of different frameworks and a range of different ideas. So they really have to be, and I support that. But when you're talking about this repetition and exploration of some of these quite complex things and interactions with the environment, can be quite challenging. So without that framework, and aligned to that was the appendices. So what they did say is at the end, they go, well, if you are struggling for ideas, we've put some different activities in the appendices for you to use and to dip in and out of. But from when I look at these aren't these are activities which I looked at them, look like they're from the physical training manual. So that they're very much isolated group tasks, but around sort of their trunk movements, leg movements, rolls, run, but they're focused very much on the child and how they're moving and how they could move within a task, not the environment interaction, which the wider movement education of a moving growing curriculum was all about. So I'm not sure if they ran out of money, time, or they themselves didn't have a framework to potentially guide. So what I mean by this, they didn't provide principle or lesson plan template to which you could guide, or a guiding of how you progress through the units, which I think most teachers, including myself, when I've gone around, would really help encourage me. So that's a few of the reasons I saw, Colum. If you flick to the next slide, I guess then there's just more of a practical elements to this. Like you see that lovely picture in the background. I've been in primary schools and I've had to turn up 20 minutes early, half an hour early, trying to lug all this equipment out for my Key Stage 1 to deliver. It was highly impractical in many ways to be able to expect you could get this out and use it week in and out. So it's quite onerous, quite demanding around these things. And at the time, new theories of learning were coming out. New theories, which we're going to come on to, were coming out, and they were pretty easier to package up, use, required less equipment, were easier for us to digest, which I think really moved people away from it. The other thing is, for older children, I think people struggle to understand, well, okay, middle, secondary, Key Stage 2, 3 and beyond, how do we start using this in those settings? So I think there are a number of reasons for it, but there are a few which I have.
So if I can summarize that, James, I think there's two things going on here. What we have is this ambitious movement-oriented curriculum about creating an environment, allowing people to explore, allowing people to move in a variety of ways, well-intentioned, but then two challenges. The practical challenge of lugging out the equipment, and also of supporting teachers. So if we're going to give them the agency and the autonomy to design a curriculum and an environment that will help people and be relevant to their wider lives, we also need to give them support alongside that. And that then takes us to the theoretical problem, that it seems to me that at this stage, what was missing was a theoretical explanation or theoretical concepts that these teachers could use to inform how they designed those environments, how they created those environments that encourage movement, variability, encouraged exploration. Is that a fair summary? Practical problems and also of a theoretical concept.
I think so, but I did. Well, if we're trying to develop, call it motor competence, skillfulness, whatever you want, these children to become versatile movers in the environment, or how do you support the shape. We couldn't articulate it. Like, when do you step in? How do you do it? Are we trying to work convergently to a very specific movements within this? Well, that environment may not afford it. So it became things of like how you can support that process, like that theory which could potentially do that.
And it reminds me a little bit,
something to provide a framework or handlebars.
Sorry, it reminds me a little bit of Noel's work on the call. Again, Noel is doing work in coach education, and he's touched on, and I'm speaking for Noel now here, he can come on and speak for himself, I'm sure, but he's touched on, you know, the agency of coach educators, and that we want to give them agency to meet people, meet coaches, work, you know, meet the learners where they are, work with them. But when you give agency and autonomy, we also need to give resources and support. And it sounds to me in the 50s and 60s, we were giving this agency to these teachers. We weren't necessarily giving them theoretical or the practical support to make that happen. In terms of theory though, James, the 60s wasn't completely devoid of learning theory, was it? I'm going to hand over to you for this section. In fact, it was prior to the 60s, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, so, well, it was actually, this was very much, again, politically driven by the World War. So long time of the World War, the Second World War, lots of innovation going on. Engineers were creating these mighty war machines, planes, tanks, etc. And the governments of the US, the UK, in this arms race had a real problem, is we can't train pilots or drivers of these machines quick enough without them crashing them and etc. along the way. So what they did is they brought psychologists and engineers together, and they came, and this was kind of where cognitive psychology was born. And what we start to see is the psychologists left this when seeing, well, the brain is very much is like a powerful processor of information. So if you just tap the key a second here, Colum, and it is a very exciting time for learning, because it did allow us to start packaging and understanding how the learning process takes back. But we take in visual, auditory, our sensory systems taking information, our brains make sense of this. And then through experiences, it kind of demystifies or creates, puts color or develops a schematic of how this movement program works. And as we come in, but the key here is, I want to highlight, is decontextualize. So you can develop these schemas or movement patterns in certain environments, and they will transfer across environments. So in context doesn't really matter. You learn it in one way, you can do it somewhere else. And that was key. And so this was really the idea here. And these were more repetitions, the more practice we had, the stronger these schemas got, the more able we were to pick up cues from the environment to then pick up. So this was the general consensus or idea. But what we see is, and the work of that's Paul Fitz down the bottom there, who is a famous cognitive psychologist based in America. If we click on one slide, Fitz and Posner developed these stages of learning. So the idea here is you have this cognitive stage, associative stage, and autonomous stage, and this is how we learn. So the idea in the cognitive stage, we don't know anything about a task or how we learn. So what we have to do is very much give lots of instruction, lots of guidance, simplify the task to offset a lot of the cognitive load. So we don't want a really rich environment with lots of things going on, because it's too much for us to process. We take it out, we reduce it down to the bare bones. Once they've got the basic movement template skill, well, we can start adding environment and information, so they can start bringing their heads up to see where potentially to pass the ball. And it moves PE to this idea of, we're not on a journey of exploration to the automation. We want to master things. So once we master it, we can apply it to different environments. We'll practice it in isolated settings, and then we'll put it into a game once we have the mastery of that. And it's based on this development of a schema theory. And you see it still, the cognitive load theory, what we see in educational circles today, very much built on this idea of just schema theory. Like there's the same foundations there. But that's the idea. Yeah.
If I just summarize there, James, so if we think 1960s or late 50s, we've got these teachers with this ambitious curriculum and coaches with this ambitious curriculum of exploration, open minds, creativity, exploring and creating environments for people to explore to help them solve problems. They're struggling with the practicalities because they haven't got resources or time or to bring out the equipment. They're also struggling for a theoretical understanding as to how to design that. And then on parallel to that, we've got this development of cog-sci approach, rooted, as you said, in kind of World War II, and kind of emphasizing this idea of, okay, let's not overload, let's drill down, let's focus, let's develop towards an autonomous stage of mastery of techniques, for instance. And
cognition is driving our learning behavior is what's happening. It's a top-down approach which is happening, and that's how, and that's the learning process.
So with that in mind, it's probably not surprising that we've lost track then of that moving and growing curriculum, which was considering the environment, and we started to look at the internal mind, we started looking at memory, we started looking at a traditional session of a warm-up, practice a drill, practice a technique, P is for techniques, for instance, you know, as David Kirk might say, and then to hope that that transfers into a game at the end of the session, because the teachers at least had a framework that they could rely on, and that gave them some way of progressing people, and it gave them a way of seeing improvement over time. So that gave them a theoretical framework that was missing from probably some of the earlier moving and growing stuff. Is that a fair summary?
I think so, Colin. I think that's a fair summary.
Yeah, I'm sure people will disagree in the chat.
Yeah, no, I'm sure they will.
You're muted at the moment, so let's get on before they interrupt, you know? Because I think we see this in coaching again. This is Reese's work again. And if we imagine that Alan Wade book, which was a games-based approach, which was open minds, it wasn't complete free-for-all games. Let's be clear, there was still stuff in there about control. But by the 90s, we see texts such as this in coach education, which have an emphasis on football technique. You know, the idea of repetition so that that technique becomes automatic. How can we get that technique automatic? Well, let's break it down into small steps, kind of reflective of reducing the cognitive load. The passing checklist is a famous one. You know, we break down the passing checklist and every player has to do it, okay? As if you can pass in a decontextualized environment, you know, a rehearsal. And then once they've got that, let's move into a game. So it's not completely without games. It's not completely, I don't want to set up a straw man here that there isn't progression towards an environment. This framework gave them a progression towards applying stuff in games once they've been mastered through an autonomous stage. Interestingly, from Reese's research, again, when he spoke to educators on the time, they kind of reported that, you know, the materials, the experiences, they were physically demanded and physically tested, but they also felt it was quite constraining. So the idea of exploration, different ways to move, different ways to exist within an environment was replaced with, this is the technique and you've got to be able to do it if you want to progress. So that's interesting how that approach to coaching and possibly PE are similar linked and may have been influenced by the information processing cognitive psych approach that was missing when the moving and growing was there. So I think that's interesting. It's important that we don't set this up, I think, as an either or, because there's value in that. You know, there's different types of knowledge that we can learn. So, you know, we don't want to say that there's no role for learning about information here, James. I wonder if you want to talk us through this knowledge of and knowledge about, because both can be powerful.
Yeah, I think they're both very powerful and types of knowledge, no doubt. Knowledge of is that experiential experience, really, about dwelling in a place, and then that knowledge you gain. If I have a toothache, I have a knowledge of how painful of it. I can only tell you about how painful, and so unless you've had that toothache, you wouldn't appreciate it. But it's that lived knowledge, I would say, of an experience. Now, in a moving growing or an ecological curriculum, you wouldn't be able to replace that with knowledge about to be able to learn. You just can't. From a cognitive space, you can tell someone about and represent it in symbols and other text about how to do something, and then they potentially can go out and do. So it's a different type of knowledge. And I take this term from James Gibson's knowledge of an environment, so dwelling in place. When you have knowledge about is that symbolic knowledge we're learning through this medium, for instance, from me and you, telling us you about it.
So if I give a really crude example, and I'm a terrible swimmer, I've got about a width in me, if on a good day. But I do know that I bend my elbow, and I do know I push with my palm. So I've got knowledge about swimming, but I don't have knowledge of how to swim. And for me to get both would be ideal. I want knowledge about, but I also want to have immersed experiences in an environment where I can get knowledge of how to swim and not just about. Is that overly simplistic, or is it a helpful metaphor?
Yeah, I think it leads into the pictures you're about to show on the slides here, Colum. So, and I guess it's just
trying to set up these pictures.
Yeah, you are. It's a good point, and it's one. If you pull them up, Colum, I'll just quickly highlight. Like here at Marsh, so we can see, and Colum showed earlier, we had this wonderful outdoor swimming space, which gives our children in the community at the time, I'm sure, a wonderful knowledge of open water, or not open water, but outside, what that dynamics of that water would feel like if they were to go down to North Wales in many ways. Gives them knowledge of that body of water environment. What I worry about is what we are now tending to see more and more is the diminishing of the spaces where we can get this experiential knowledge of an environment, and we're replacing them, hence our next photo, with places where we can learn knowledge about things. So, for instance, we now see a centre of teaching excellence is now inside space, and where I would pedagogically teach students, obviously we'd go out, but we wouldn't be able to do the swimming elements. We can't do. So I think it's just important as we're learning through movement, this idea of how much time we're spending in knowledge about, and versus how much time we are spending knowledge of an environment, and same in coaching. And really the powerful one, and where we need to move, learning to move and learning through movement, is that's what we need to be doing, and in a range of those different environments as well.
And I see the same thing in PE now. Our GCSE is largely taught in a classroom, which reflects a cognitive view of learning, that learning is a change in memory, and if we can change, a long-term change in memory. Whereas the idea, actually, when lockdown hit, and this brings us back to this idea of liminal experience, and sports halls were closed and astroturfs were padlocked up, how many of our young people had knowledge about their environment to go for a hike, to repair a bike and cycle? How many of them had knowledge to be able to swim in the local river? Or did they just have knowledge about sport techniques? So I think this is quite interesting for us to think about here, is that, how we conceive knowledge does have implications for how we teach, what environments we create, and what learning environments, and how that then helps somebody to exist in the wider world. And that maybe we need to have a reflection on that. And that's kind of what we're doing this year. We haven't really got to answers, but you can kind of see where we're thinking. In terms of reflection, in terms of this liminal experience, at some point we are going to move to our new building. At some point we are going to be post-COVID, and we do need to think about how might we want learning to be conceived in that environment. So we do have the next kind of 10 minutes, maybe 15, if we can keep James short on a couple of these slides.
Yeah, sure.
Explore what this might look like as we move forward. So James, I wonder if you might talk us through this to begin with.
Sure. So I guess over the last 5 years or so since coming back from Oz and starting at Liverpool John Moores, I've been very interested in exploring ecological approaches and coming across the moving growing curriculum and trying to bring the two together. And I guess I'll start here with this ecological dynamics and movement education and movement learning, movement growing. is there was some lost influences on movement learning around the same time, 1950. So when the moving growing curriculum was being developed and was being employed, at the same time we had James Gibson and Eleanor J. Gibson working in America, exploring ecological psychology. So this idea of direct perception are coming. Unbeknown to them was Nikolai Bernstein in Russia, who was a motor learning academic physiologist, and he was exploring the ideas around variability in repetition, and how no matter how stable a movement may appear, there is variability in there, and it's a variability to support self-organization of a task. But again, they were doing some really quite forward thinking, which fits very well with a movement education, and it kind of provides a framework or a beginnings to start understanding how children learn to move. So if we just jump on, because I haven't got time, people can read the papers if they want to explore this. I go into quite a lot of depth in these theories.
Yeah. So just maybe to put people in the picture, then we've got moving and growing in the 50s. We've got Alan Wade trying to open minds and encourage creativity, but they weren't aware of Gibson's work over here in the States, and they weren't aware of Bernstein. Bernstein wasn't translated to much later, and the dominant theory that came was the information processing cog site. So not surprisingly, people moved towards that then. But you think actually there's value in looking at them and going back to the moving and growing. So, you know, and that's where your work has kind of gone in the last few years, and where it's possibly going post-COVID, James.
Yeah, no, certainly. So the idea of ecological psychology, there's a bit to it, including like the knowledge parts, which I've briefly mentioned, but really the one fundamental idea is this idea of direct perception. So the idea is all the information we need to perform movements is available in our environment. So the light arrays from the sun, or be it the indoor sports light, refract off environmental features, and that ecological information is directly perceived by the person, the individual. So that means as we move through an environment, we see that light refracts in different ways, and new information comes, and it becomes available, and certain information dissolves. Alongside this, at the same time, to support our functional movement, we are a hugely complex group of systems working to support our skeletal, cardiovascular, cardiorespiratory, the list goes on. But it's this relationship between our environment and this pickup of ecological information and this self-organizational process that leads to our functioning, our interactions with our environment, and our movement behavior in which we see. Yeah, so Colum, do you want to jump on about this, the child? So what does that mean to you? And then I'll try to unpack it a little bit more.
So I'm not as versed in this ecological approach as you are, but when I look at this picture, James, what I see here is, you know, a child interacting with, you know, the plank of wood on the ladder, you know, and they've looked at that and looked at what opportunity does it afford them. And I keep thinking of my own child here, possibly because he could come in at any moment, but he's all...
Can I stop you 1 second? We'll go straight into that. So what we see, that equipment affords multiple opportunities, multiple solutions. Okay, that child there picked up, and based on their capabilities, they have all these different systems, their previous historical interactions. It's an embodied and embedded approach to cognition, meaning it's not from the mind, based on all that kind of whereabout development, but they're afforded the opportunity to scoot up the ramp and potentially jump off it.
And that's what I was going to say.
Okay, sorry, I cut you off. I just wanted to...
You did. Yeah, that was naughty. So yeah, because Jacob couldn't do that, you know, he's 3.5, but he loves the ladder, so he'd probably climb up the back of that. So for him, the opportunity, the equipment would be perceived differently. He would self-organize and he would interact with it differently. And I look at that again as, you know, a way to say, actually, there isn't a one-size-fits-all way of existing. The way this child is existing with this equipment in this world is different to the way Jacob would exist with it. You know, and again, I think, again, a top-down pedagogy prescribing, are we reducing that variability, and are we excluding people, and are we allowing them to explore? Whereas what you appear to be saying here is that the ecological dynamics is giving us the framework to explain some of the creativity that might have happened in the 1950s.
It makes us just, for me, a couple of things. One, you start to not see learning as acquisition, but adaptation to an environment, and a goodness of fit is created through that information you pick up and your current effectivities or capabilities. And as an educator, you start to respect, if a child engages with a task in a certain way, that's not a cognitive choice potentially. It's an embodied, embedded of a whole system self-organizing to do that. And it's different. It's embodied and embedded. I think that's key. It's not top down. It's a whole body. It's a whole system interacting. And you're part of that system. Yes. The way you set those instructions, everything you've done has helped create that fit, that child's head. Now we should move on, Colin, because we're going to run out of time.
Yeah. And I think, you know, the bit over here on the left-hand side in particular is the part that probably will be most helpful to people at this point. So, you know, planning and non-linear pedagogy.
Yeah, so I guess here it's like, as I said, when you start to explore this move, but I've already highlighted the challenges really for planning for a program. So one example I've done, and been really reading a lot of Jai Chow and colleagues' work on nonlinear pedagogy, which is built on these idea of ecological dynamics and has key concepts or principles to which you need to think about when designing. So that being representative learning design, movement perception coupling, like keeping things coupled, so having that equipment out because that's what their light will refract certain ways back to the information they're going to pick up. An external attention or focus, I don't want to be telling them internally to focus on parts of their moving body, because actually what I want to do, that could potentially counteract that self-organization process. And then alongside that, it's about manipulating constraints. So rather than, again, telling them how to do something, I may change features in the environment to try to shape that movement behavior come out. One of the most important points which I kind of take apart, and I'm racing through this, but is the idea of what we're trying to do when I'm giving a teaching point or a moment. It's about destabilizing the current behaviors. So if you're seeing this self-organization taking place, after a while, a child movements will look repetitious, will look the same. We'll see a stabilization. What I'm trying to do there is destabilize the behavior to create instability in the movement again, because that recreates reorganization, all these systems being constrained, and a new self-organization, and new information potentially will emerge from that environment. So it becomes very cyclical. But what the main thing, I guess, to pull from this is it gave me a framework to start thinking about any activity I wanted to use, which I thought would be appropriate for a year 1 PE class, but how potentially I could really explore this exploration ideas within it, and that some of those ideas around knowledge of an environment that through repetition without repetition.
And I think that's the key point of this, just to maybe help people here, is that what you're saying is there's 4 or 5 concepts here from the nonlinear pedagogy approach, which might actually have been the framework that people needed in the 1950s when moving was there.
It's helped me to start exploring these things. I think it gives you a framework. It gives you, that's my lesson plan. It's no longer a linear plan where I have warm up, etc. I have 3 of these activities where I will go through, okay, representative learning, like what do I want to emerge from this lesson? What activities, what types of movement? Or when perception action coupling, what types of equipment do I need to afford those opportunities? If it's rolling, I need lots of ramps. I need lots of different designing. Okay, then it's external attention, focus, constraint. That's more how I'm interacting with the children. Okay, so potentially type of questioning I'm doing. Okay, the type of manipulations I could make for individual children. And then the teaching moments is around that variability. So again, this is just me problem solving my way. Other people will find different and better ways, I'm sure, but it does allow you to explore this space in more depth.
So I think that's really interesting to solve that problem. We see that here on the left-hand side. Um, we've got videos here which might struggle to play, so I'll just maybe talk through. But see here on the left hand side, James, this is the moving and growing curriculum, and it talks about imagination and how providing equipment like a curtain can allow a child, in this case, she can reach out and she can imagine she's a queen. You know, she can then adopt powers and expression and carry herself as she might feel like a queen does. So, you know, setting out equipment there involving imagination and exploration might allow one child to move one way. I think that's something that you've tried to apply in the lessons as part of the Sample PE project at John Moores through the Gruffalo. Do you want to quickly talk us through the Gruffalo? And we might be able to get
that's a bit of this idea of softer pedagogy, where we're trying to help children attune to environments and explore environments in different ways. So we see the girl there, through having the curtain to the back, princess, she embodies and this and the behaviours do. So, but the same idea I'm applying in our curriculum. So reading the Gruffalo with all the gymnastics equipment now, if we meet the owl on our journey, well, I don't tell you what we're going to do climbing. They will just naturally try to go high. They will like to embody the effectivities. It's hunter-gatherer tribes and do like have a similar philosophy around this. But it's the idea they embody those effectivities of that animal, and they will then accordingly explore the space as such. So be on top of the equipment of a snake underneath it. So the mouse quick movements. So you can start exploring and playing around, and you'll see these movements emerge through this. And yeah, it was just a nice way to start doing, and the videos aren't really working, but this is me just having a go at some of these different lessons and playing around with these ideas.
So for me then, I'm fascinated by this because I understand people will struggle with the videos, they're buffering a lot and they're playing, but what you've done here is created a landscape, allowed people to go out and explore almost like 1950s moving and growing, almost like 1920s IM Marsh going, you know, and exploring on field trips and so on and so forth. But you've used those nonlinear pedagogy concepts as the theoretical framework to inform that. And that's allowed you to see, how do I interact with the children? How do I manipulate constraints? And what equipment do I need to put out? So that's interesting to me. But I'm also going to get phenomenological on you now, because I'm fascinated by this from a kind of a care pedagogy. Because even though the videos are struggling, I think people will notice here that what you're doing a lot of is what you term soft pedagogy. You're not loud, you're not instructing, you're not lining everybody up, you're moving around and observing, and that then lets you infer the needs. So you're watching them interact in this environment, and you're then inferring, okay, this person might need an external focus of attention, or I might need to adapt an equipment to support this person. Okay, this person has found stability here. Can I adapt the equipment to challenge them and make it less stable, or vice versa? So there's some inferred needs going on here through observation, but I also see you asking questions, you know, why are you moving like that? How could you move? And now I'm seeing expressed needs where the children themselves get to say, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm moving, this is what I want to do. And for me, that's the roots of almost a caring pedagogy, that you are focused on the needs. You've created an environment, but you're not just implementing needs that you inferred when you wrote a scheme of work in the summer. You're actually observing the needs of the children there and then in that particular environment, listening to them there and then in that environment, and using that as a way to help them learn. And that for me seems, you know, a very situated caring pedagogy, whereas I think we often talk about the needs of children, and then we produce a 6-week scheme of work before we've even met them in some cases. You know, how is that based around the needs of children? You know, so I do see some care pedagogy in here, James. I wish we had collected some data when you did these lessons.
Yeah,
did we collect?
We collected a lot of data, but no, just to your point there, Colum, it's about supporting attunement and children attending to that environment they're in. You don't prescribe, so you don't overreach, because if they've got to do it, they need, the only way they can develop a knowledge of the environment And if I self-organize them into it, I'm taking away that learning process, that idea about variability and
So I'm jumping in again with my care here, because care again would respect the autonomy. I think I've seen Mark on the call, and Mark's very keen for us to respect the rights of the child. And yes, they've got the autonomy to learn. It reminds me of an old Heidegger quote where, you know, teaching is difficult because to teach you've got to let learn. So you've got to step back and allow them to learn. And I see some of that in this pedagogy, whereas a loud, more forceful, dictatorial, this is what you do, this is the technique, you must master this. Are we letting them learn? Are we providing space? Are we respecting their voice? These are things for us to think about, as I say, as we come out. I'm going to move us on because I'm sure there will be questions, James. Yes. So we can move on to the next slide. We'll see some data and also some examples of people who are trying this out there in real schools as part of their daily life. You start by maybe talking us through the data here?
Yeah, sure. So part of the project is we've really gone out into 12 schools, primary schools, year one, first year of formal PE, and had a play with these pedagogies. And what we've done is 6 schools carried on with their current PE provision. 3 schools got a very much a traditional information processing led type of multi-skill curriculum of learning the skills in kind of rote. And then you've got this ecological one, and we've pre and post assessed within this. And what we're finding, and we're working through the data and will be this summer, but what we're seeing is those children who have had this more ecological approach, where we have been trying to support them explore environments, are being much more, if you put them in, almost see this as a transfer test. If you take them out of that PE environment, but put them in an enriched environment and say, right, how many different ways can you find to in this environment? They've been whizzing off, interacting, participating, finding different ways to move, different explorations. So they're almost those kids you pop down in a park and then off they go. They're just gone, climbing trees around. That's what we're starting to see. The other groups weren't showing that same display of exploration behaviour. They were tending to... This
brings me back to lockdown.
Well, potentially less likely to be inclusive in explore, but come up with different ways to move within that space. So, and just on variety, it's just to highlight, there is, though I've been very focused on early year one primary schools, secondary schools, Mo's just written a lovely blog, his exploration of this approach in his secondary school and how he's exploring his, doing some really great work. So is the chaps, Daniel and Ross at St David's College in Wales. They're really exploring the possibilities of what this could mean and help them make a meaningful PE curriculum. Context is everything within an ecological approach. So what works here for sample, the pedagogy, I think we can learn to support teachers, but it has to be nuanced. We have to think of the environment we are in doing this. That's very important to this as well. But anyway, we need to on. Questions, Colum.
Yes.
We need to wrap it up.
Okay, very quickly, if we don't cover your question, or if there's stuff that we said, because it was a whistle-stop tour and it's not a finished project, it's what we've been thinking about over lockdown, when we've neither been at Marsh or our new building. It's pre and post-COVID pedagogies. We're trying to think here. You've got more ideas coming out in your book there, and then the PE team and the coaching team at John Moores do a teach meet every couple of months. The next one's coming up on 10th of June. You can just get in touch with us on Twitter or on email or whatever, and you can come and join in on that. So we will talk about these more. My final take-home messages, I think as I look back, what have I learned from those early images? I've learned about pedagogy needs to lead people out to new experiences beyond the school gates, beyond the university. The theoretical understanding of learning is really important. I think that really did hurt the 1950s curriculum. And I think we've shown how an information processing theory has influenced pedagogy. So it has contributed. It gave people a framework to show progression. It gave people a framework to structure their lessons. and teachers were struggling with that without that at the time, and still are to greater and lesser extents. So theoretical conceptions of learning are key. I think we've shown links across PE movement and coaching, that what we're really looking at here is learning, regardless of those environments of situated learning. And we've recognized a little bit that, we're preparing people for a world that exists. It exists before we're born. This is the world we're born into. And as PE, as coaches, we're trying to prepare them to exist in that environment. And so hopefully maybe we spark some ideas, and, we might imagine what pedagogies might help best prepare them to exist in that world. And hopefully we've given you some ideas. That's us done. We're way over time. Apologies. Should we squeeze in some questions, Hayley?
Oh, yes, please. Colum and James, thanks very much. I think you covered loads of ground there. And to be honest, I think I could have carried on listening to you. So that was really, really quite interesting. And one thing I've discovered personally is on the IM Marsh campus, I always wondered what that mini round, what I thought was a running track, and then I thought, was it something that was cycling? But it kind of didn't fit either of those. So now I finally know it was the outdoor swimming pool.
I'm glad you brought that up, Hayley, because I worry we're going to get in trouble at John Moores. What we should say is that when that was closed down, there was a big indoor pool built alongside it as well. So the students weren't left without any swimming. Okay, so I worried that, the VC will be on to me, basically, to say, so there was something put in place. But I think the picture shows that what a great learning environment a swimming pool could be. For learning off,
Most definitely. Now, I know Greg has posted a few comments, so I don't know if either of you could just maybe scan those and respond, or Greg might want to say a little bit more.
I mean, I like Greg's first question. I'll give James maybe time to read Greg's second, but Greg, you're asking here, have we educated ourselves out of the ordinary common sense? I'm getting the feeling that you think actually, not all was wrong with the kind of what you're getting at here. There was some stuff there that we maybe overlooked. I'm not a historian, but I see value in it, Greg. That's why we were lucky that the FA part funded and John Moores part funded the PhD to do the history of coaching. I argue that history of coaching paper, which Reese done, I think that should be on every coach developer's induction to show where we've come from. If we don't learn from our history, we're doomed to repeat the mistakes of the past. That's the one. I wouldn't say we're the only generation that's overlooked history. I think history shows us that as well. Lots of mistakes have been repeated. But I'm rowing in behind you. There's a lot of value in looking at what's gone before us and being humble enough to do that.
I certainly think there was a big thing after the war of feeling we could, with enough science and enough engineering, we could almost automate anything. We could get the perfect answer. And I think there's certain arrogance that wasn't unique to any one area. So if you look at what was happening in business and industry at the same time, I think you'll find big parallels. And that combined with a completely understandable desire to see teaching in a more professional manner, there were ideas of professionalism built within teaching and education that got steamrolled with new ideas of what it meant for us to gain status. So in order to show ourselves as more professional, we tried bringing in ideas from outside without really scrutinizing them. And that's where I think we've possibly educated ourselves out of being able to deal with these things. So things that would have been questioned in the 1950s were less likely to be questioned in the 1990s.
So I'm seeing the value in humility, the value in critical thinking, and the value in deep knowledge and going back through. And I think James would agree with me, this isn't a finished presentation. We need to do more work on this, and we need to go back through. So, you know, everything we've said today is still a work in progress. You know, we're not pronouncing on this. James, is there anything you want to add there?
Not really. I think no. I agree. I think just your last point there. I think, but coaching, while there may be lots to learn, I think like there are people in high performance sport who are doing some really wonderful job around this space as well. Again, I've taken these ideas from Keith, David, and people who that's where their focus is. It's more of a sport coaching end and exploring those. So they've written a lot about there. So yeah, there's definitely good work going on all around this, but there is opportunity from learn from each other for sure. Cool. Is there any other questions from anyone at all?
Ben,
I've got a question.
Hayley, go for it.
Yeah, I'm allowed a question, aren't I? I think I was struck a little bit early in the presentation when you were talking about individual environment and the idea of exploration and creativity, and that's a very seductive proposition in terms of a young person's experience, and this is how my head operates. I think when you were talking about that, I was immediately thinking around ideas around inclusive practice, actually. And then later, James, when he was talking about the ecological dynamic, you mentioned adaptation as well. And I think for me, what your presentation is kind of illustrated is the way in which, there's a black box there in terms of how we think about inclusive practice. But I think the challenges are the kind of theoretically, but also the toolbox that we can offer to practitioners around how to begin to work inclusively in terms of autonomy and creativity. So I think it just connected with me around these broader notions of inclusion, actually. So we look in the past and we see possibilities, and actually maybe what happened in the past signals where there are areas to still be developed in relation to practice contemporary. Yeah.
I know, James, you've got some thoughts around that, but one of the things that strikes me straight away, Hayley, is involving the environment gives us a more authentic account and gives us an authentic base to interact. So if we were to look at how, let's say, somebody with an impairment, for instance, how does the environment influence their experience? Well, actually, in a lot of our pedagogy, we've divorced the environment, we've siloed it off, and we do pedagogy, and then we say, now go out into this environment. And guess what? That environment is not inclusive. So actually, by maybe bringing in that environment into our pedagogy, we can see the challenges that somebody faces. We can meet them in a more authentic context and enable them and enable us to support them better. And that's where I thought there might be more of an authentic caring concept happening then. Instead of us imposing, this is sport and this is how you play in it, let's look at how you exist in the current environment. Let's observe, let's listen to you, and let's see how we can support your needs. That's kind of where I am. I think including that environment within our pedagogy would give us a more authentic, caring opportunity. James, I don't know if you want to jump on that or disagree with me.
No, not at all. I think it's understanding like these biological systems and this idea of neuro, or the idea of degeneracy. So there's many to one ways to find a solution. There's more than one way. There's many ways to find a solution in environment. So the idea there is, this again, I was reading somewhere in this kind of this research, which when you look at like brain damage, or if there's structural damage, then actually new circuits are made and etc. in the brain to find new ways of doing. So actually through, where am I going with this? Or this idea that there are many to one. So you may have it rather than be, there's many solutions, ways to come to a solution rather than one. And degeneracy is an important thing within this concept. I'm not really doing it justice in explaining it, but the idea here is, again, movement skill assessments are terrible for this. Say if a child has a disability, if they can't reach an optimal movement template, well, then they could potentially be marked down as not being a good mover, etc. But actually, if you put them in an enriched environment and they find lots of wonderful ways to explore that environment and come up with many different ways, well, it's like it's moving away from a deficit model to seeing, well, how enriched they are. Well, actually, the children who could actually have no disabilities but has very little experience may just stand there and not know what to do and just look at the teacher for, well, what do you want me to do now? They've got that environment's not offering them any invitations. So yeah, it moves us away from this deficit model, but to understand, well, how that child is functionally navigating what's available to them in the environment. And I want to say something on this degeneracy point, but for some reason the words are escaping me. So I'll have to say that for another time.
Oh, thanks for that. Any other questions from anyone?
To be fair, it is 5 o'clock and sunny.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And
So
it hasn't been sunny for some time.
can I just, and it's been sunny for more than 10 minutes, which is what you normally claim, Colum. So you've done well in your house today. I'd just like to really thank you both for the really, you know, engaging, thought-provoking, most definitely, presentation that you've offered today. I know myself and colleagues will be going away and thinking about it and talking about what you've said today in relation to our students. So thanks very much. As usual, the recording will be made available via Sarah somehow. She's the Director of Technology, so knows how that's going to happen. Annette's reminded me to remind everybody that we are planning a PESP Invisible College at some point in September. So watch this space in terms of dates, and there's kind of sessions as well. And again, I know Sarah, Tom and Annette are really quite welcoming of anybody if they've got ideas in relation to any particular kinds of activities, or if they'd like to present or lead on something as well. So we are in that planning stage, so if there's any appetite from anyone, please let any of us know. But I think Colum and James are really happy now if we log off and go for a walk or do something. But
good.
thanks very much again. That was brilliant today.
Thanks, everyone.